Friedrich Krupp was the canon king, the billionaire arming the German Empire. But in secret, he hosted gay sex parties in the caves of Capri. When the press exposed him, his billions couldn't save him. Days later, Europe's richest man committed suicide. He was not destroyed by war. He was disassembled by the truth. This nightmare did not begin in Capri. It started in Essen, inside a mansion built less for humans and more for machines, the Villa Hügel. Located in Essen, the ancestral home of the Krupp dynasty was less a house than a fortress. It was a monstrosity of 269 rooms, designed by Friedrich's father, Alfred Krupp. Alfred had been a brilliant but deeply eccentric tyrant, a hypochondriac terrified of fire who demanded that the house contain no wood. The floors were stone, the window frames were iron, and the heating system was a complex, rattling network of vents that blew hot, dry air through the cavernous halls. It was a cold, sterile environment, vibrating constantly with the distant thud of the steam hammers from the nearby factories. Friedrich, known to his family as Fritz, was born into this coldness in 1854. From the moment he drew his first breath, his life was preordained. He was the only son of the great Alfred, the vessel for the company's future and the nation's prestige. Nature, however, had not designed Fritz for the role of an ironmonger. Alfred was hard, abrasive, and obsessed with the mechanics of guns. Fritz was soft, bookish, and physically frail. He suffered from asthma and rheumatism. He was a man of quiet sensitivities who preferred the silence of a library to the roar of a foundry. As a young man, Fritz displayed a passion that had nothing to do with artillery. He loved the natural world. He was fascinated by marine biology, by the microscopic organisms that floated in the ocean, by the hidden, silent lives of creatures beneath the surface. In a different life, one where his last name was Smith or Miller, he might have become a professor or a museum curator, spending his days cataloging plankton and writing gentle academic papers. But he was a Krupp. Such softness was not permitted. The expectation was absolute. He would lead the company, he would serve the Kaiser, and he would embody the rigid, militaristic virtues of Prussian manhood. He tried. For decades, Fritz Krupp performed the role he was assigned with heartbreaking diligence. When his father died in 1887, Fritz took the reins of the empire. He surprised everyone by being a capable, if reluctant, businessman. Under his leadership, the Krupp works expanded massively. He secured lucrative government contracts, built the German Navy, and amassed a fortune that made him the richest man in the empire. He did his duty to the state. He also did his duty to his lineage. He married Margaret von Ende, a woman of impeccable aristocratic breeding. She was intelligent, capable, and formidable, the perfect matriarch for the Krupp dynasty. Together they had 2 daughters, Bertha and Barbara. To the outside observer, the picture was flawless. The Cannon King in his castle with his loyal wife and heirs, standing as the pillar of German society. But inside the Villa Hügel, the air was unbreathable. The marriage was a functional partnership devoid of passion. Margaret was the manager of the household, the guardian of etiquette, and the enforcer of the family's social standing. Fritz was the absentee landlord of his own life. He was a man wearing an iron mask, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with generals, and slowly dying of loneliness. The Germany of the late 19th century was a dangerous place for a man like Fritz Krupp. It was a society obsessed with a specific definition of masculinity. Men were warriors, fathers, and leaders. Deviation was not just frowned upon, it was criminalized. Paragraph 175 of the German Imperial Criminal Code specifically outlawed unnatural fornication between men. The law was a sword hanging over the head of every gay man in the country. A conviction meant prison, the loss of civil rights, and total social annihilation. But beyond the law, there was the social stigma. In the hyper-masculine culture of Prussia, homosexuality was viewed as a disease, a weakness, a betrayal of the national character. For the head of the Krupp Empire, the man who armed the military to be exposed as a homosexual would be a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. It would not just destroy a man, it would destabilize the state. So Fritz lived a double life. In Essen, he was the remote, dignified industrialist. But inside, he harbored desires that terrified him. He was attracted to men. Specifically, he was drawn to youth, to the vitality and physical beauty of young men who possessed the freedom and simplicity he could never have. In the gray, soot-covered world of the Ruhr Valley, these desires were suffocated. He needed an outlet. He needed a place where the rules of Prussia did not apply. He needed a sanctuary. In 1898, acting on the advice of his doctors, who recommended the warm sea air for his asthma, Fritz Krupp traveled south. He crossed the Alps, left behind the smoke of Germany, and arrived in Italy. He found his way to the Bay of Naples, and there, rising out of the azure water like a dream, was the island of Capri. Capri has always been a place apart. Since the time of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, who ruled the world from his cliffside villa on the island, Capri has been a magnet for the eccentric, the exiled, and the dissolute. It is a landscape of dramatic beauty, sheer limestone cliffs dropping into water so blue it looks dyed, hidden grottos, and winding paths scented with lemon blossoms and jasmine. But more importantly, in the late 19th century, Capri was a moral free zone. It was a place where wealthy foreigners, English lords, French artists, German barons, came to indulge in behaviors that would have seen them arrested back home. The locals, impoverished fishermen and farmers, had learned to accommodate the strange whims of the wealthy visitors. Tolerance was part of the island's economy. For Fritz Krupp, arriving in Capri was like inhaling for the first time in his life. The physical relief was immediate. The warm air soothed his lungs. But the psychological relief was profound. Here, nobody cared about the production quotas of the steelworks. Here, the rigid hierarchy of the Prussian court dissolved in the Mediterranean sun. He checked into the Grand Hotel Quisisana, the most luxurious establishment on the island, but he didn't stay confined to the hotel. He began to explore. He fell in love with the island with the obsessive intensity of a man who has found a lifeline. He returned the next year, and the year after that. His visits grew longer. He would spend months at a time in Capri, usually in the winter and spring, leaving Margaret and the girls back in the gloomy Villa Hugel. He told them, and the world, that it was for his health. He told them that it was for science. This was the great cover story of his life, marine biology. Fritz commissioned 2 magnificent yachts, first the Puritan and later the Maja. These were not just pleasure boats. They were floating laboratories. He fitted them with dredges, nets, and glass tanks. He hired legitimate scientists to accompany him. He spent days out on the water, hauling up specimens from the deep, cataloging new species of worms and plankton. This scientific pursuit was genuine. He truly loved it, but it also served a crucial purpose. It explained his presence. It explained why the most powerful businessman in Europe was spending months floating off the coast of Italy instead of running his company. It gave him a respectable reason to be surrounded by a crew of young, fit sailors. But slowly, the biology became secondary to the sociology of the island. Fritz began to integrate himself into the local life of Capri in a way that was unusual for a man of his station. Most aristocrats stayed in their villas, socializing only with each other. Fritz went down to the ports. He walked the narrow streets of the Marina Piccola. He began to talk to the locals, the fishermen, the boatmen, the mule drivers, the coral divers. He was captivated by the men of Capri. To Fritz, they were everything he was not. They were physically strong, tanned by the sun, unburdened by intellectual neuroses or social rigidity. They lived simple, elemental lives. There was a strain of romanticism in this, a wealthy northerner's fetishization of the noble savage. But for Fritz, it was also a desperate grasp for connection. He wanted to be near them. He wanted to be liked by them. And he had the means to ensure he was liked. Fritz Krupp brought to Capri a level of wealth that the islanders could barely comprehend. He didn't just spend money, he flooded the local economy. He tipped with gold coins, he paid for surgeries for sick children, he rebuilt roofs. He became a one-man welfare state for the island. The locals called him Il Signor Krupp, pronouncing it with a mix of reverence and affection. He wasn't the canon king here. He was the kindly German gentleman with deep pockets and a strange love for fish. This generosity, however, was the foundation of the trap he was building for himself. It was transactional. In Capri, money could buy silence, it could buy loyalty, and it could buy access. As Fritz grew more comfortable, his guard began to slip. The scientific expeditions on the Maja became less about plankton and more about the crew. He began to hire young men not for their nautical skills, but for their appearance. He surrounded himself with a retinue of handsome Italian youths. He started to reshape the island to fit his needs. He bought land. He didn't build a massive villa, he preferred the hotel, but he bought pathways and gardens. Most famously, he financed the construction of the Via Krupp. It was a marvel of engineering, a paved switchback path that snaked down the sheer face of the cliff, connecting the town of Capri and the Quisisana Hotel directly to the Marina Piccola below. The official reason for the road was public benefit, a gift to the town to help the citizens reach the sea. The real reason was privacy. The road provided Fritz with a direct private route from his hotel suites to the harbor where his yachts were moored, and more importantly, to the hidden places along the coast where he could be alone. It was a literal pathway from the respectable world of the town above to the underworld of desire below. By 1900, Fritz Krupp had established a routine. He was effectively living two lives. In the summer and autumn, he was in Essen, enduring the stiff collars and the stiffer conversations of the German elite, playing the role of the husband and the tycoon. In the winter and spring, he was in Capri, wearing loose linen suits, wearing a straw hat, and holding court in the cafes. But a man of his power cannot simply disappear. He was being watched. The German expatriate community in Italy was a nest of gossip. Everyone noticed the company he kept. Everyone noticed that the richest man in Europe seemed to prefer the company of illiterate donkey drivers and teenage barbers to the company of counts and dukes. They noticed the way he looked at them. They noticed the scholarships he gave to handsome young men. At first, it was just whispers. Krupp is eccentric, they said. The Germans are always strange when they come south. But as the new century turned, the whispers grew darker. Fritz was becoming reckless. The safety of Capri, the feeling of invincibility that his money provided, intoxicated him. He began to push the boundaries further. He stopped trying to hide his preferences. He began to organize gatherings that were not about science or charity or sightseeing. He found a cave. It was located on the steep slope of the Monte Castiglione, hidden by thick scrub and accessible only by a difficult path, or, conveniently, by the new road he had built. It was a natural grotto, deep and cool. To the locals, it was just a hole in the rock. To Fritz Krupp, it was a blank canvas. He didn't see a damp cave, he saw a private club. He saw a sanctuary where the laws of the Kaiser could not reach him. He saw a place where he could finally be the man he wanted to be. He bought the land surrounding the cave. He hired workmen to smooth the floor, to widen the entrance, to secure the ceiling. He began to ship in furniture, not rustic camp chairs, but heavy, expensive pieces, rugs, lamps, sofas, cabinets, stocked with the finest wines and champagnes. He transformed this geological feature into a bizarre, subterranean living room. He called it the Grotto di Fra Felice, the Grotto of Brother Felix. The name was a joke, a play on the history of a monk who had supposedly lived there centuries ago. But there was nothing monastic about what Fritz was planning. He wasn't building a hermitage for prayer. He was building a stage for the second act of his life, an act that would be defined by hedonism, voyeurism, and a dangerous intimacy with the young men of the island. The construction of the grotto marked the point of no return. Before this, his indiscretions were scattered. A look here, a touch there, a private conversation on the deck of a yacht. But the grotto gave his desires a physical address. It institutionalized them. It was a hub. And soon he would begin to recruit the members of his secret society. He would call them his congregation. Back in Essen, Margaret sat in the Villa Hugel, reading the brief, cheerful letters her husband sent from the sunny south. She looked at the gray sky and the smoke rising from the chimney stacks. She sensed the distance growing between them, a distance that was measured in more than just miles. She didn't know yet about the cave. She didn't know about the congregation, but she knew that something was wrong. The silence from Capri was too loud. The facade of the happy marriage was beginning to crack, and through the cracks the cold wind of scandal was starting to blow. Fritz Krupp believed he had built a fortress of solitude in the Mediterranean. He believed his wealth was a shield that could deflect any arrow. He was wrong. He was building his own tomb, one golden coin and one stolen moment at a time. And as the winter of 1901 approached, the King of Steel was about to make the mistake that would cost him everything. He was about to invite the world into his cave. The transformation of the Grotto di Fra Felice was not merely a renovation. It was an act of psychological architecture. When Friedrich Alfred Krupp stepped across the threshold of that cave, hidden amidst the limestone crags of Monte Castiglione, he was stepping out of the 19th century and into a timeless, mythological space of his own creation. The cave was his theater, and he was both the director and the lead actor. To the casual observer hiking the cliffs, the entrance was nothing more than a dark fissure in the rock, obscured by rosemary bushes and wild myrtle. But inside, the damp, salty air was displaced by the scent of heavy incense, expensive tobacco, and the floral perfumes of the era. Krupp had the interior fitted with a level of luxury that bordered on the absurd. Rugs from the Orient were layered over the smooth stone floor to dampen the sound of footsteps and the chill of the earth. Soft, velvet-covered divans and armchairs were hauled up the treacherous paths by local laborers, creating intimate seating areas illuminated by the flickering glow of dozens of oil lamps and candles. The light in the cave was always amber and low, casting long, dancing shadows against the stalactites, softening faces, blurring lines, and creating an atmosphere where reality felt suspended. It was a womb of stone, protected from the prying eyes of the Kaiser, the church, and his wife. In this subterranean parlor, Fritz Krupp founded his secret society. He christened it the Congrega di Fra Felice, the congregation of Brother Felix. He naturally was the Grand Master, assuming the persona of Fra Felice, the happy friar. It was a joke that carried a sharp edge of irony. He was playing at being a monk, a figure of chastity and discipline, while presiding over a sanctuary dedicated to the exact opposite. To solidify this brotherhood, he commissioned a jeweler to create a specific insignia, a small golden tie pin shaped like a monk carrying a lantern. The pin was not just a piece of jewelry, it was a passport. To wear the golden monk was to be marked as one of Krupp's chosen. It signified access to the inner circle, to the parties, and most importantly, to the vast reservoir of the Krupp fortune. It was a badge of belonging that glinted on the lapels of the young men of Capri. A silent signal flashed in the piazzas, and the port that said, "I belong to the German." And who were they, these members of the congregation? They were not the aristocrats or the intellectuals who frequented the Hotel Quisisana. They were the island's youth. They were fishermen, coral divers, mule drivers, barbers, and masons. They were the working-class sons of Capri, possessing a rugged, sun-bleached beauty that Krupp found intoxicating. To Fritz, a man raised in the pale, sterile, over-civilized world of the Prussian elite, these young Italians represented a vitality that he was desperate to consume. They were nature to his industry. They were dark-haired, olive-skinned, and physically uninhibited, moving through the world with a casual grace that no amount of etiquette training in Berlin could replicate. The dynamics within the cave were complex. On the surface, Krupp played the role of the benevolent patron. He was the kindly, eccentric uncle who wanted to help these young men. He spoke to them in broken, enthusiastic Italian. He asked about their families, their dreams, their debts, and he paid. He paid for everything. If a young man mentioned his father's fishing boat needed repairs, Krupp paid. If a sister needed a dowry, Krupp paid. If they simply wanted a new suit of clothes to look sharp for the Sunday promenade, Krupp paid. But beneath the benevolence lay a profound power imbalance. This was not a gathering of equals, it was a transaction. Krupp was purchasing affection, or at least the performance of it. He was buying the company of youth. The locals, impoverished and struggling in an economy that had barely moved past the medieval era, quickly understood the rules of the game. If you pleased Il Signor Krupp, if you laughed at his jokes, listened to his lectures on marine biology, and attended his gatherings in the cave, your life would change. You would have money in your pocket and a golden pin on your chest. The activities inside the Grotta di Fra Felice have been the subject of intense speculation and sensationalism for over a century. The socialist press, when they finally broke the story, painted pictures of Roman-style orgies, of depravity that would make Caligula blush. The truth, as suggested by private letters and police reports, was likely a mix of the artistic and the carnal. Krupp saw himself as a connoisseur of beauty. He was obsessed with the classical ideal of the male form. The gatherings often involved what were known as tableaux vivants, living pictures. In these performances, young men would pose as Greek statues or mythological figures, illuminated by the lamplight. They would stand frozen as Apollo, or Narcissus, or Saint Sebastian, their bodies dusted with flour or chalk to resemble marble. Fritz would sit in his armchair, smoking his cigar, gazing at these living sculptures. He would photograph them. Photography was his other great passion, a hobby that allowed him to document his obsession under the guise of art. He took thousands of photographs on Capri. Landscapes, yes, but endless portraits of his favorites. The camera gave him a way to stare without blinking, to possess the subject, to freeze the moment of youth before it faded. Sometimes the atmosphere was festive, filled with the sounds of mandolins and guitars, the air thick with the smoke of expensive cigars, and the smell of roasting meat and flowing wine. The young men would sing Neapolitan folk songs, the sentimental melodies echoing off the cave walls. Krupp would preside over the feast, his face flushed, feeling a sense of camaraderie that was utterly absent from the boardrooms of Essen. He deluded himself into thinking they loved him. He told himself that in this cave, rank didn't matter. But the gold coins he pressed into their hands at the end of the night told a different story. Among the congregation there were favorites. Historical records and police files whisper names, though many have been lost to time. There was mention of a young barber, a musician, a boatman. Krupp would often select one or two to accompany him back to his suite at the Hotel Kisasana or to stay on the yacht Maja. These relationships were the core of the scandal. While Krupp viewed them through the lens of classical mentorship and romantic friendship, citing Plato and the Greeks to justify his inclinations, the reality was a wealthy, middle-aged man soliciting sexual favors from youths, some of whom were barely out of adolescence. The age of consent in Italy at the time was significantly lower than in Germany, and the cultural attitudes toward male-male intimacy were different, less pathologized, but still officially sinful. However, the sheer scale of Krupp's operation made it impossible to ignore. He wasn't just having a discreet affair, he was colonizing the island's youth. He was warping the local economy. Fathers began to encourage their sons to catch the eye of the German millionaire. Jealousies erupted between families. Why did the baker's son get a gold pin and a new bicycle, while the butcher's son got nothing? The golden reign of Krupp's wealth created fractures in the tight-knit community of Capri. Yet for a long time, the silence held. It held because the money was too good. The hoteliers, the shopkeepers, the police, and the church all benefited from Krupp's presence. He was the island's greatest benefactor. When he donated a significant sum to the local church or funded a public works project, the local priest and the mayor were more than happy to look the other way regarding what happened in the cave. They rationalized it. They told themselves he was just an eccentric foreigner. They told themselves that as long as he was discreet, as long as he paid, it was none of their business. This conspiracy of silence allowed Krupp to become increasingly reckless. He began to feel invincible. The Canon King persona had successfully been shed. In his mind, he was no longer the arms dealer. He was the artist, the lover, the free spirit. He walked the streets of Capri wearing soft flannel suits and a straw boater, often surrounded by a phalanx of giggling young men. He stopped caring who saw him. He stopped worrying about the German tourists who might recognize him. He was drunk on the atmosphere of the island, intoxicated by the illusion of safety. He even began to invite his German friends to visit, trying to bridge his two worlds. He wanted to show off his paradise, but those who came were often shocked. They saw a man who had lost his bearings. They saw the most serious industrialist in the empire, giggling with teenage fishermen playing dress-up in a cave. They saw a disaster waiting to happen. One specific visitor, a close associate from the steelworks, later wrote in a private diary about his unease. He described a dinner in the Grotto where Krupp, slightly inebriated, toasted his congregation with a fervor that bordered on the manic. The associate looked around the cave, at the velvet sofas, the flickering shadows, the young men lounging with a familiarity that was completely inappropriate, and he felt a chill. He realized that Fritz Krupp was not just on vacation. He was in a state of decomposition. The discipline that had built the house of Krupp was gone, dissolved in the wine and the warm nights. Fritz, however, was blind to the danger. He was happy. For the first time in 48 years, he felt alive. He wrote letters to Margaret that were frighteningly banal, describing the weather and the fish he had caught, completely omitting the reality of his days and nights. He thought he could keep the door to the cave sealed. He thought that what happened in Capri stayed in Capri. But Capri is a small island. It is a sounding board. Whispers travel fast over the water. The local dissatisfaction was growing. Not everyone received a gold pin. There were teachers who were concerned about their students spending nights in the Germans' cave. There were political radicals on the mainland who saw the decadent foreigner as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the bourgeoisie. And there were the journalists. In the taverns of Naples, stories began to circulate about the German Croesus and his harem of boys. These stories were initially dismissed as tall tales, the kind of gossip that always surrounds the super rich, but the details were too specific. The gold pins, the cave, the names. The journalists began to sniff around. They took the ferry across the bay. They started asking questions. They didn't approach Krupp. They approached the boys. They approached the ones who had been rejected, the ones who were jealous. The predator was about to become the prey. Fritz Krupp, who had spent his life manufacturing weapons to destroy fortresses, had failed to realize that he was living in a glass house. He was playing a game of high stakes with the moral codes of two nations, betting his immense fortune against the prejudices of his age. He believed his money made him untouchable. He believed that the Grotto di Fra Felice was a sanctuary. He did not hear the sound of the pen scratching against paper in a newspaper office in Naples. He did not hear the tectonic plates of European politics shifting beneath his feet. He only heard the music in the cave and the laughter of his favorites. As the spring of 1902 turned into summer, the golden pins shone brightly in the candlelit darkness, unaware that they were not badges of honor, but targets. The fuse had been lit, not in Essen, but right there, in the paradise he thought he owned. The explosion would not be of gunpowder, but of ink, and it would be far more lethal than any cannon shell his factories had ever produced. 2,000 kilometers to the north, in the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley, the sky was permanently bruised by smoke. Inside the Villa Hugel, Margarete Krupp sat in silence. Margarete von Ende was not a woman of the Mediterranean. She was Prussian to her marrow. Born into the lower nobility, she had married Fritz in 1882 in a union that was less a romance and more a merger of duty and stability. She was intelligent, capable, and possessed a spine of steel that rivaled anything produced in her husband's foundries. For 20 years, she had performed the role of the industrialist's wife with flawless precision. She managed the vast household, she oversaw the charitable foundations, she raised their two daughters, Bertha and Barbara, and she maintained the dignity of the Krupp name. But dignity is a heavy coat to wear when you are wearing it alone. For years, Margarete had endured her husband's absences with stoic resignation. The health trips to Capri had started as weeks, then stretched into months. She was left to explain to the Kaiser, to the generals, and to the society matrons why the most important man in Germany was never at home. She had accepted the official narrative, the asthma, the nerves, the marine biology, but Margarete was not naive. She lived in a world where information was currency, and she was surrounded by people who talked. The servants knew, the secretaries knew. The whispers from the south did not stop at the Italian border. They traveled on the same trains that carried Krupp steel. By the summer of 1902, the atmosphere in the Villa Hugel had shifted from lonely to toxic. Margarete was no longer just a neglected wife. She was a woman under siege by the truth. Whether through anonymous letters or discovering Fritz's obsessive photographs, the denial finally broke. The tragedy of Margarete Krupp is that her subsequent actions were likely not born of malice, but of a desperate desire to save her family. In the rigid moral code of 1902, homosexuality was viewed through two conflicting lenses. It was a crime, yes, but to the enlightened upper class, it was often seen as a madness, a nervous disorder that could be cured or controlled. Margaret did not want to destroy her husband. She wanted to fix him. She wanted the madness in Capri to stop before it consumed their reputation. She made a calculation. She decided that she could no longer handle this alone. She needed the authority of the state to intervene. In October 1902, while Fritz was still lingering in his Italian paradise, Margaret took a step that would prove fatal. She sought help from the highest levels of the German establishment. The details of this intervention are shrouded in the secrecy of the era, but the consensus is that Margaret contacted high-ranking officials, possibly the police president in Berlin, or perhaps members of the Kaiser's inner circle. She presented them with the evidence she had, the letters, the descriptions of the grotto, the names of the favorites. Her goal was a quiet, firm intervention. She imagined that the Kaiser, or the police chief, would take Fritz aside, perhaps threaten him with the asylum laws, and force him to end the charade in Capri. She wanted him brought home, chastised, and returned to his duties as a husband and father. She believed the state would protect its own. After all, Krupp was the armorer of the Reich. The government needed him. Surely they would handle this with the utmost discretion. She was wrong. She had lit a match in a room filled with gunpowder. Margaret failed to account for the volatile political landscape of Wilhelmine Germany. The German Empire was not a unified bloc. It was a vicious battleground. On one side stood the establishment, the Kaiser, the aristocracy, the military, and the industrialists like Krupp. They stood for order, monarchy, and tradition. On the other side stood the rising tide of the Social Democratic Party, SPD. The SPD represented the workers. They represented the thousands of men who toiled in Krupp's factories for low wages, who lived in company housing, and who were forbidden from joining unions. To the socialists, Friedrich Alfred Krupp was the ultimate enemy. He was the canon king who profited from the machinery of death. He was the capitalist vampire growing fat on the labor of the proletariat. For years, the SPD had been looking for a way to damage Krupp. They had attacked his business practices, his profits, and his treatment of workers. But these attacks bounced off his armor. He was too rich, too essential to the state. They needed something else. They needed something that would strip away his moral authority. When Margaret went to the authorities, she assumed the information would stay within the gentlemen's club of the ruling class. But Berlin was a sieve. The police department was full of factions. There were sympathizers to the socialist cause or simply corrupt officials who traded information for favors. The dossier on Fritz Krupp, the accusations of unnatural acts with Italian youths, did not stay in a locked drawer. It began to circulate. It leaked. The first tremors were felt not in Berlin, but back in Italy. The Italian press, less censored and more sensationalist than the German papers, began to print stories. In the late summer and early autumn of 1902, the Neapolitan newspaper Il Mattino and the socialist paper Propaganda began running articles about a foreign Croesus who was corrupting the youth of Capri. They didn't name Krupp initially, but the descriptions were unmistakable. They wrote of the grotto, of the gold pins, of the lavish tips. They described him as a predator buying the bodies of the poor. These Italian clippings made their way north. They landed on the desks of the editors of Vorwärts Forward, the central organ of the German Social Democratic Party. The editors, led by men who had spent their lives fighting the Krupp Empire, must have stared at the papers in disbelief. Here was the weapon they had been praying for. Paragraph 175 was a double-edged sword. The socialists generally opposed the law in principle, viewing it as an archaic tool of state oppression. Many in the party advocated for the decriminalization of homosexuality. However, the hypocrisy of the ruling class was a target too juicy to ignore. Here was the Kaiser's best friend, the pillar of Christian morality and Prussian discipline, violating the very laws that his class used to imprison commoners. If a factory worker in Essen was caught with another man, he went to prison and lost his livelihood. If Fritz Krupp did it, he built a grotto and threw parties. The socialists decided to use paragraph 175 not to persecute homosexuality per se, but to expose the rot at the top of the empire. They began to prepare their attack. Meanwhile, Fritz Krupp returned to Germany in late October 1902. He was oblivious to the extent of the danger. He knew about the Italian rumors. He had even bought up all the copies of a local paper in Capri to suppress a story, but he viewed it as a local annoyance, a problem that could be solved with money. He did not know that his wife had gone to the authorities. He did not know that the Vorwärts editors were translating Italian police reports. The homecoming at Villa Hugel was icy. The silence that greeted him was different this time. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but the silence of judgment. Margaret refused to play the part of the welcoming wife. There were closed-door meetings, arguments that echoed off the stone walls. The daughters, Bertha and Barbara, were kept away, shielded from the tension that was suffocating the household. Fritz tried to carry on as usual. He attended board meetings. He went to Berlin to meet with government officials. But he began to notice a change in the way people looked at him. The warm handshakes were a fraction of a second shorter. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. The Berlin whisper was in full effect. The elite knew. They were distancing themselves, waiting to see if the bomb would go off or if the state could defuse it. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was the most notable absentee. Usually, when Krupp was in Berlin, he was a favored guest at the palace. Now the invitations dried up. The Kaiser was a man terrified of scandal. He had his own rumors to contend with, his own circle of artistic friends that the public viewed with suspicion. He could not afford to be seen standing next to a man accused of pederasty. In early November, the pressure became tangible. On November 8, 1902, the Augsburger Postzeitung, a Catholic conservative paper, ran a short article. It was cautious, vague, but damaging. It alluded to the rumors from Capri. It was a warning shot. Fritz Krupp was now a cornered animal. He retreated to the Villa Hugel. He was sick, his asthma flaring up under the stress. He paced the great halls surrounded by the portraits of his ancestors, the men of iron who had built this empire. He must have felt the walls closing in. He had the money to buy islands, to build fleets, to fund excavations, but he could not buy his way out of this. Margaret watched him. She saw the fear in his eyes. This was what she had wanted in a way, to scare him straight, to force a confrontation that would end the Capri chapter. But she had lost control of the narrative. She had pulled a thread hoping to untangle a knot, and instead the entire tapestry was unraveling. The Social Democrats were ready. They had verified the sources. They had the accounts from the Italian newspapers. They had the whispers from the Berlin police. They decided to strike. They knew that publishing the story would provoke a libel lawsuit. They knew they might go to prison for attacking the most powerful man in Germany. But they also knew that in a courtroom, the truth would come out. They would force Krupp to testify. They would parade the witnesses from Capri before a German judge. They would destroy the myth of the Krupp family once and for all. On November 15, 1902, the presses at Vorwärts began to roll. The ink was black, cheap, and smeared easily, but the words it formed were clearer than crystal. They did not use euphemisms. They did not hide behind vague allusions. They drafted an article that was a direct indictment of Friedrich Alfred Krupp. The headline was simple: Krupp in Capri. It was a declaration of war. The newspaper was bundled onto trucks, loaded onto trains, and distributed to every corner of the Reich. It was carried into the beer halls, the factories, the barracks, and the cafes. It was about to be read by millions of people. In the Villa Hügel, Fritz Krupp went to bed on the night of November 14th, perhaps believing that the worst was over, that the rumors would fade as they always did. He did not know that the morning train was bringing his execution warrant printed on newsprint. The secret garden was burning, and the flames were about to engulf the entire German Empire. On the morning of November 15th, 1902, the sun rose over a Germany that was about to change forever, though few knew it yet. In Berlin, the air was crisp and cold, typical of late autumn. In the working-class districts, men were already in the factories, their faces smeared with grease and soot. In the cafes of the Friedrichstrasse, the intelligentsia were settling in for their morning coffee, and on street corners across the capital, newsboys were shouting the headlines of the daily papers. Among the stack of broadsheets was Vorwärts. It was the central organ of the Social Democratic Party, a paper despised by the establishment, read religiously by the workers, and feared by the government. On this particular Saturday, the front page carried a story that would act as a guillotine for the reputation of the Second Reich's most prominent citizen. The headline was not screamed in bold, hysterical type. It was almost clinical in its precision. Friedrich Alfred Krupp on Capri. To the uninitiated, it sounded like a travelogue, but as readers moved down the column, the text revealed itself to be a masterpiece of political assassination. The article did not merely report rumors, it weaponized them. It began by describing Krupp's long stays on the Italian island, ostensibly for his health. It mentioned the luxury, the yachts, the generosity, and then with the surgical skill of a prosecutor, it pivoted. It is not the beauty of the landscape that attracts Herr Krupp, the article stated, but the opportunity to indulge in his specific inclinations, which are punishable under German law. The paper described the brotherhood of the Grotto. It described the recruitment of local men. It noted that the scandal was so well known in Italy that the name Krupp had become a synonym for pederasty in the local dialect. But the master stroke of the article was its conclusion. It did not attack Krupp for his morality alone. It attacked the hypocrisy of the German state. It reminded its readers of paragraph 175, the law that sent thousands of ordinary German men to prison for the very acts Krupp was performing with impunity. If a worker were to conduct himself in such a manner, Vorwärts argued, he would be locked away. But because this is the richest man in the empire, the friend of the emperor, the police remained silent. The impact was instantaneous and cataclysmic. In 1902, there was no internet, no television, no radio. The newspaper was the supreme arbiter of truth. Once it was in print, it was real. The shock wave radiated out from Berlin, traveling along the telegraph lines to Hamburg, to Munich, and inevitably to Essen. Inside the Villa Hügel, the newspaper arrived like a physical blow. The fortress that Alfred Krupp had built to withstand fire and storm was defenseless against paper and ink. Fritz Krupp read the words that destroyed his life in the silence of his study. One can only imagine the physical sensation, the cold wash of adrenaline, the constriction of the throat, the sudden, terrifying clarity that the game was over. The reaction from the public was a mixture of horror and schadenfreude. For the working classes who lived under the thumb of the industrial tycoons, this was a revelation of biblical proportions. The man who owned their labor, who dictated their wages, who lived in a palace while they lived in tenements, was a moral degenerate. It validated every grievance they held against the ruling class. For the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, the reaction was panic. Krupp was one of them. If he could be exposed, if the sanctity of his private life could be violated so brutally, who was safe? The scandal threatened to discredit the entire social order. Fritz's immediate instinct was to fight. He was, after all, a man of immense resources. He summoned his lawyers. He contacted the police commissioner in Berlin. He demanded that the paper be confiscated, the editors arrested, the story retracted. He issued a statement claiming the article was a monstrous lie, a political smear campaign orchestrated by the socialists to destabilize the armaments industry. He sued Vorwärts for libel. It was a fatal tactical error. In his desperation, Fritz Krupp forgot the fundamental rule of legal warfare. Never ask a question if you don't want to hear the answer. By suing for libel, he initiated a legal process that would require a trial, and a trial meant evidence. The editors of Vorwärts were not reckless. They had not printed the story on a hunch. They had done their homework. They had the police reports from Italy. They had sworn affidavits. And most terrifying of all, they had witnesses. The moment the lawsuit was filed, the socialists began to arrange for the boys of Capri to travel to Germany. They were prepared to put the fishermen and the barbers on the stand in a Berlin courtroom. They were prepared to ask them, under oath, what exactly Frau Felix had done in the grotto. The prospect of such a trial was the establishment's nightmare. It would be a circus. The most intimate, sordid details of the Kaiser's friend would be dissected in public. The golden pin, the naked tableau vivant, the financial transactions, it would all come out. Within days of the lawsuit being filed, the reality of the situation began to dawn on Fritz. He was not the plaintiff. He was the accused. The isolation began immediately. The Villa Hügel, always a lonely place, became a tomb. The telephone stopped ringing. The telegrams that arrived were cold and formal. The social calendar was wiped clean. The most devastating silence came from Berlin. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man who had dined at Krupp's table, who had called him "my dear Fritz," who had relied on him to build the German Navy, vanished. The Kaiser was a man who loved the trappings of power but fled from the responsibility of friendship when it became inconvenient. He was terrified of being tainted by the scandal. He knew the rumors about his own circle. The Eulenburg affair was already brewing in the background, and he could not afford to be linked to a confirmed sodomite. Fritz sent letters to the palace. They went unanswered. The message was implicit but clear. You are dead to us. Trapped in Essen, Fritz's health collapsed. The asthma that had plagued him all his life returned with a vengeance, exacerbated by the crushing stress. He could hardly breathe. He spent his days in a darkened room, attended by doctors who could offer no cure for public humiliation. And what of Margaret? She was trapped in the house with the ghost of the man she had married. She was now the wife of a pariah. The intervention she had sought, the quiet correction she had hoped for, had mutated into a monster. She had wanted to save the family name. Instead, she had ensured its infamy. The tension between husband and wife in those final days must have been unbearable. They were co-conspirators in a tragedy of their own making. He by his actions, she by her revelation. They moved through the vast halls of the villa like strangers, avoiding each other's eyes, united only by the sound of the mob gathering at the gates. Outside the walls of the estate, the police investigation was quietly gathering steam. In Berlin, prosecutors were obligated to investigate the claims made by Vorwärts. Paragraph 175 was a criminal statute. They could not simply ignore it because the suspect was a billionaire. Detectives were dispatched. Files were open. The legal machinery that Krupp had always assumed was there to protect him was now turning its gears in his direction. By November 20th, 5 days after the article appeared, Fritz Krupp was a broken man. The bluster of the lawsuit had faded. The realization had set in. There was no way out. If he went to court, he would be destroyed. If he dropped the lawsuit, it was an admission of guilt and he would be destroyed. If he fled the country, he would be a fugitive, his assets seized, his name disgraced, and he would be destroyed. He was 48 years old. He was the richest man in Europe, and he had no future. The atmosphere in the Villa Hugel took on a surreal quality. The servants continued to polish the silver and serve meals on porcelain plates, maintaining the rituals of the aristocracy while the world burned down around them. Fritz reportedly spent hours looking at his collection of marine biology specimens, perhaps finding some solace in the silent, simple world of the deep sea, a world without laws, without newspapers, without judgment. He must have thought about Capri. He must have thought about the warm sun on the rocks, the smell of the lemon groves, the laughter in the cave. That paradise was now the instrument of his torture. Every gold coin he had given away was now a piece of evidence. Every photograph he had taken was an indictment. The irony was absolute. The thing that had made him feel most alive was the thing that was now killing him. On the evening of November 21st, the mood in the house shifted from anxiety to finality. There are no records of the conversations that took place that night. Did he speak to Margaret? Did he say goodbye to his daughters? Or did he maintain the stiff upper lip of the Prussian officer class until the very end? The night deepened over the Ruhr Valley. The fires of the Krupp steelworks painted the sky in shades of orange and black, a hellscape of industry that Fritz had inherited but never truly loved. He retreated to his private chambers. The house was quiet save for the ticking of the grandfather clocks and the distant rumble of the trains. Fritz Krupp was alone. The Cannon King had been stripped of his armor. He was just a man, terrified and exhausted, holding the weight of an empire that had rejected him. He knew what the morning would bring. More headlines, more questions, more shame. He decided that he would not see the morning. The dawn of November 22nd, 1902, did not bring relief to the Villa Hugel. It brought a silence so profound that it seemed to stop the clocks. The servants moving through the labyrinthine corridors walked on tiptoe, sensing the shift in the atmosphere before a word was even spoken. The master of the house, the richest man in the German Empire, was dead. The official announcement, released to the press with suspicious speed, stated that Friedrich Alfred Krupp had died of a stroke or cerebral apoplexy. It was a medically plausible explanation for a man known to have high blood pressure and chronic asthma, a man who had been under unimaginable stress for weeks. But in the salons of Berlin, the beer halls of Essen, and the newsrooms of London and Paris, almost no one believed it. The timing was simply too convenient. The scandal was at its zenith. The legal proceedings that would have destroyed his reputation were days away from commencing, and now the accused had removed himself from the dock. The prevailing theory, whispered then, and accepted by most historians now, is that Fritz Krupp took his own life. Whether it was a pistol from his own armory or a vial of poison from his medicine cabinet remains a secret locked within the Krupp family archives. If there was a suicide note, it was incinerated. If there was a weapon, it was hidden. The family, the company, and the state had an immediate, unified goal: to sanitize the death of the Cannon King. The body was laid out in the great hall of the villa. The man who had sought softness and warmth in the caves of Capri was now surrounded by the cold, dark wood of his ancestral home, dressed in the uniform of his station. The transformation of Fritz Krupp from a scandal-ridden pariah back into a national hero began before the body was even cold. Margareta Krupp, the woman who had set the machinery of destruction in motion, now had to oversee its reconstruction. She became the guardian of the gate. She suppressed her own grief, her guilt, and her anger to perform the role of the grieving widow. She understood, perhaps better than Fritz ever did, that the name Krupp was bigger than any one person. It was an institution. It had to survive. The funeral, held on November 27th, was a masterpiece of state theater. It was designed to overwhelm the senses and silence the critics. The city of Essen came to a standstill. Tens of thousands of workers, the Kruppianer, lined the streets. They stood in silent, somber ranks, their caps in their hands. Many were there out of genuine loyalty to the family that fed them. Others were there because the foremen were watching. It was a demonstration of industrial feudalism. The message was clear. Look at this army. Look at this power. Do you really care about what happened in a cave in Italy? And then the Kaiser returned. Wilhelm II, who had abandoned his friend in his hour of need, who had ghosted him while he was alive, arrived in Essen with the pomp of a returning conqueror. He was dressed in the full regalia of a field marshal, his face a mask of righteous indignation. He did not come to apologize. He came to rewrite history. Standing over the coffin of the man whose lifestyle he had privately despised, the Kaiser delivered a speech that stands as one of the most audacious acts of gaslighting in the 20th century. He did not mention Capri. He did not mention the Grotto, the boys, or the gold pins. Instead, he launched a savage attack on the messengers. He turned to the gathered mourners, his voice ringing with imperial fury, and declared that his friend had been murdered, not by a bullet, but by ink. A deed has been done in German lands, the Kaiser thundered, so base and mean that it has made all hearts shudder. The man who lies here was German to the core. He lived for his fatherland, and he has been slain by the poisonous darts of the envy of the Social Democrats. It was a brilliant political pivot. By framing Fritz's death as a political assassination by the socialists, the Kaiser achieved two things. First, he absolved Fritz of all moral wrongdoing. Fritz wasn't a homosexual. He was a martyr. Second, he weaponized the death against the SPD, the greatest threat to his own power. He turned a sex scandal into a battle for the soul of the nation. He demanded that the workers of Essen shun the murderers who had printed the lies. The narrative worked. In the face of the emperor's wrath and the solemnity of the funeral, the truth was buried alongside the body. The liberal press fell silent, cowed by the accusation of being unpatriotic. The investigation into paragraph 175 was quietly dropped. One does not prosecute a dead national hero. But the most grotesque injustice was yet to come. The libel trial against Vorwärts, the newspaper that had printed the truth, continued. Even though the plaintiff was dead, the state prosecutor took over the case. In a courtroom where the truth was inadmissible if it threatened the state, the editors of Vorwärts were found guilty of gross insults. They were sentenced to prison. The men who had exposed the double life of the most powerful man in Germany were locked in cells, while the man who had lived that life was eulogized as a saint. With Fritz gone, the iron gates of the Villa Hugel slammed shut. Margaret assumed control. She did not run the business directly. That was left to a board of directors, but she held the shares in trust for her eldest daughter, Bertha. Margaret became the regent of the Krupp Empire. She was formidable. She purged the house of Fritz's presence. The marine biology collections were donated or stored away. The photographs of Capri were likely destroyed. The name Capri was never spoken in the house again. She raised Bertha to be the Queen of Steel. Bertha would grow up to be as hard and unyielding as her mother. It was Bertha who would lend her name to the Big Bertha howitzers that would smash the forts of Belgium in 1914. The Krupp works continued to churn out the weapons of war, growing larger and more lethal, fueling the German war machine for 2 world wars. The scandal of 1902 became a footnote, a whispered rumor that was drowned out by the roar of the 20th century. And what of the paradise lost? On the island of Capri, the Grotto di Fra Felice fell silent. The furniture was removed, the lamps extinguished. The congregation disbanded. The young men who had once worn the golden pins took them off, hiding them in drawers or selling them for scrap. They went back to their boats and their nets. The golden rain had stopped. Life on the island returned to its slow, sun-drenched rhythm. The locals, wise to the ways of the world, learned to keep their mouths shut. The memory of Il Signor Krupp became a local legend, a story told by old men about the German giant who loved the sea too much. The Via Krupp, the beautiful winding road Fritz had built, remained. It remains there today, a physical scar on the cliffside, a path that leads from the light of the town down to the darkness of the water. It is a monument to a man who tried to build a bridge between his two selves and fell into the abyss between them. The story of Friedrich Alfred Krupp is often read as a simple tale of hypocrisy, a rich man doing as he pleased while the poor suffered. But it is more than that. It is a tragedy of the iron closet. Fritz Krupp was a man born into a suit of armor he did not forge and could not remove. He possessed the power to arm empires, to shake the foundations of Europe with his artillery. Yet he was utterly powerless to alter the one fact of his existence that mattered most. He lived in an era that had no language for who he was other than the language of pathology and crime. He tried to buy his freedom. He thought that if he stacked enough gold coins, they would form a wall high enough to keep out the world. He thought he could partition his soul. Industry in the north, nature in the south, duty in Essen, love in Capri. But the human soul is not a factory. It cannot be compartmentalized so neatly. The pressure builds, the steam must escape, and when the vessel is flawed, it explodes. His death was a warning that the establishment ignored. It was a crack in the facade of the German Empire, a hint of the rot beneath the gilding. It showed that the rigid, hyper-masculine militarism of the Reich was a performance, a brittle shell that crushed the humans trapped inside it. Today, the Krupp dynasty is gone, absorbed into corporate mergers. The smoke over the Ruhr has cleared. Paragraph 175 is a dark memory struck from the books, but the grotto remains. The water still slaps against the stone, echoing the clink of a wineglass and the desperate, doomed joy of a man who wanted, for just a moment, to be Fra Felix instead of the Cannon King. He was the master of iron, but in the end, he was destroyed by something far stronger, the fragile, terrifying truth of the human heart.